Edward Welch, let me first thank you for joining us for this second installment of the Winthrop-King online interview series. So to begin with, perhaps you could tell us about your current research?
Sure. I'm working currently on a project which is looking at modernisation in post-war France and thinking about how France was developed, rebuilt, and particularly through new urban planning from, roughly speaking, the 1950s and particularly the 1960s and then on into the 1970s. And later on today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that was done during the Gaullist presidency, so the time of General de Gaulle in the 1960s, on Paris, and how Paris and the Paris region were redeveloped and modernised in lots of different ways. And I'm interested in that because it's a significant moment in post-war history for France. This is a time when the Algerian War has just finished and there is a whole effort to thinking about France's kind of future. So it's a moment when the country, or at least the country's politicians, are very future-oriented. And I'm exploring how that's represented and manifested in the new spaces that are being built in France and Paris around that time. So part of the project is looking at how visions of French modernity and urban futures are portrayed in some of the material that's produced by the planners. But I'm also thinking about how these new urban spaces and new spaces generally are then portrayed and represented in various kind of cultural forms, literature, film, photography, and thinking about how they start to portray this kind of modernised country. And that's important because what happens in the 50s and the 60s, has a big long-term impact on contemporary France. So, the legacy of those decisions still in many ways shapes the society and the culture of contemporary France today. So it's really kind of exploring the prehistory of some of the contemporary phenomena that we see in France, in and around the big urban centres, but also more generally in terms of, its roads, its infrastructure, its sense as a nation, really, all kind of stem from these changes that were happening around that time.
Okay, great. And my next question actually comes from something that you just mentioned. So your research crosses many disciplinary divides: literature, film, photography, journalism. So could you tell us a bit about how you moved from the literary figure François Mauriac to this diverse constellation of cultural products?
Yeah, it's a curious one. I mean, my background is very much as a literary scholar. I mean, the undergraduate degree I went through in the UK was grounded in the study of literature. My PhD was on very much a literary figure, François Mauriac, who was really kind of known as a writer, a novelist in the interwar period before the Second World War. But as I was working on my PhD, I became increasingly interested in what happened to him in the post-war period, so the 1950s and the 1960s, and he entered into this kind of very intriguing collaboration with L'Express magazine, which was one of the first news weekly magazines, and sort of politically left of centre, where Mauriac had traditionally always had more kind of conservative political leanings. So that really kind of intrigued me. What was he doing working and collaborating with a journal like L'Express? And as part of that, I was thinking about how L'Express mediated him and portrayed and represented this figure who was becoming seen as a kind of an intellectual figure, really, a kind of, this is the time of the great French intellectuals, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus. And Mauriac, to a degree, was being positioned as part of that kind of pantheon. So it was in working with that material and L'Express at the time that I became interested in that period, but also then, thinking about as a kind of scholar of French culture, what sort of material you need to engage with. And it quickly becomes apparent that you need to be able to move across different sorts of forms of cultural production, different media. And really for me, it's kind of thinking about how all these things are working together and how different forms of cultural production, different forms of representation are producing, are kind of shaping our understanding of the world and mediating the world and sort of interrelating with each other and building up a picture of what's going on kind of across a kind of cultural moment. So if you're doing that, then you kind of need to be thinking about what's happening with literary texts, how literature is kind of intervening. You need to be thinking about visual culture, which obviously can be film and photography and kind of more legitimised forms of visual culture, but also things like the mass media and press photography and the visual forms that we encounter in the everyday. So it becomes much more of a sense of a kind of an economy of meaning and representation, and thinking about how all these things are connected up together. And that's kind of something I just sort of learnt to do, really. I mean, I think it's partly just responding to the material I was working with at the time, and also thinking about one's own, what it means to be working as a scholar of kind of contemporary culture. So, I guess, I mean, I'm not alone in adopting that approach, and I think it's one that's become increasingly common as time has gone on. And I think that tells us something about how the discipline that we're in, which historically was kind of, say, literary studies, has evolved actually over the past 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years, into something much more kind of fluid, actually. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's an interesting thing. I think you kind of learn a lot about different disciplines and disciplinary boundaries and things like that. So, yeah, so that was quite a long answer to a shorter question.
No, thank you. And finally, so you describe your research as focused on, and I quote here, the twin dramas of modernization and decolonization, end quote. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit about what you consider to be the relationship between these two phenomena, particularly as they are understood retrospectively from the current postmodern, post-colonial perspective of contemporary France.
Yeah, that's a big question. It's a very big question, and it's a really important question for all the reasons I was talking about earlier, in terms of how contemporary France is still kind of navigating what happened in that post-war period, and kind of coming to terms with that shift from being a kind of a colonial or an imperial nation into being a post-colonial nation, actually. And one of the interesting things is precisely how the relationship between those two events, if you like, decolonization on the one hand and modernization on the other, were conceived of at the time and have been understood retrospectively. And one of the important reference points for my thinking is the work of Kristen Ross, and in her book Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, she makes the point that one of the emphases in the 1960s was really to kind of underline the rupture with the colonial moment. And I mentioned earlier that there's a real sense of France's futurity in the 1960s, really kind of looking forward, and it's almost like a kind of the looking forward is a desire to forget. And I think that there is a sense in that period of that kind of sense of the newness being really kind of important. And Ross argues, and I would agree with her, that you need the story, the story needs to be kind of recomplicated by remembering that, of course, the two are really kind of heavily entangled. But where I'd probably diverge slightly from Ross is the idea that you've nevertheless got to kind of work with this idea of rupture and newness at that particular moment, and work through what forgetting looked like, if you like. How was France kind of reorienting itself towards a much more sense of a kind of metropolitan identity? So, you get the emergence of the idea of l'Hexagone as this kind of way of conceiving of the French nation space. And you've also got France becoming increasingly kind of embedded within a European project, so thinking itself much more as a European nation. And so you've got that kind of trajectory that established itself in the 1960s and really kind of plays through into the 80s. And of course, then you get the return of the repressed, or even the return of the forgotten in that 80s, 90s period. And I think working on France and Algeria, obviously, you're confronting that relationship with the past, with history and memory at every turn, and really beginning to kind of get to grips with France as a very kind of complex object, kind of contested object, in which you've got this sense of France's future as a kind of neat geographical space within Europe, kind of shot through kind of, you know, there's all sorts of things going on beneath the surface and sometimes on the surface, which are these traces and echoes and returns of that kind of colonial past. And the debate within contemporary France as to the extent to which one can recognise that as an essential component of modern France, contemporary France. You know, the question of France's cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism, which is such a kind of politically complex topic, and yet de facto exists on the ground. And I think that's fundamentally one of France's big problems in the contemporary era. It's reconciling that actual existing multiculturalism with an ideology, you know, the ideology of French republicanism and universalism, but also with a narrative that was set down in the 1960s, which is about France's kind of future as a modern country. And I think where we are now is the fact that there's a recognition that those two narratives, both historically and in contemporary period, are still hopelessly intertwined, and always probably will be. But what's also interesting is trying to work out how at the same time you still need to tease out those two narratives in order to understand what's at stake with each of them. So what's at stake with a narrative of modernisation and modernity, historically but into the contemporary moment. So that's why it's a drama at the time, in the 1960s, you know, the immediate kind of post-colonial moment. But that's why I think it's one of the defining kind of features of a post-colonial France as we think of it now. And, you know, I think one of the challenges that we've got, one of the exciting challenges we've got as scholars of contemporary France is thinking about France as the post-colonial nation. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is kind of contribute to that debate about how we kind of understand contemporary France in a moment where it's asserting a sort of a national sense of itself at the very moment at which it's hopelessly transnational and kind of, you know, bound up in all these kind of moments which are kind of economically determined, you know, globalization, but also historically and memorially determined its relationship with the colonies and with particularly with places like Algeria, actually. So I think that's why those two narratives are key for me, because I think once you've got to grips with those, you're really starting to understand where France has come from and where France kind of is now. Who knows where it's headed, though.
Well, thank you again, Professor Welch, for speaking with us today.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.